Election, putting my cards on the table, I can say that I gave the Labor government, when it was in power, a similar kicking to what I'm going to do now in relation to the current lot. The principles that I'm going to espouse now are ones that I believe passionately and I will not resile from. I think they're absolutely fundamental. And I put that up now so you can disabuse yourself of any claim of bias on my part in that regard. By way of background, prior to being a lawyer, I used to work as a house mover, that is a structural load mover. And it was in that capacity in the office one day. I had a call from our office in Palmerston North, and the manager there rang me up and said, "Michael, there are police officers here, they've seized our computers and all our books and we can't leave." And it was getting on 5 o'clock. I then rang up a managing director, and I'll call him Steve for the sake of the story. And I said, "G'day Steve, how's it going?" And he says, "Well, not too good. I'm at the dinner table with my wife and children. There were 3 kids, all under 5. And there are police officers with guns. And they have stopped us from leaving. They've got the guns out. And they've taken all the computers, our books. They're turning the place upside down." And I said, "Why is this?" The police wouldn't tell us at the time. 3 days later, I discovered that what had happened was that the Commercial Vehicle Investigation Unit, the trucking arm of the police, had believed that our company had underestimated over-dimensional permits in terms of height on about 20 occasions over 2 years. And that because Steve had had a firearm in the past, they believed there might have been a firearm in his house, so therefore they were going to go in there in this way, in this jackbooted fashion. Eventually the case was thrown out. I made a complaint to the Police Complaints Authority at the time. My complaint was upheld and the staff were disciplined. And that was one of the things that got me into the law. And anyway, what was important about that was that I knew, because I had a copy of the warrant eventually, that what had happened there was beyond the scope of the warrant, was unreasonable, and I could challenge it using the various means available to me in terms of the court and the complaint procedure. Now, why is that relevant in terms of today? Well, in terms of the Government Communications Security Bureau, you've got no idea at all that you've been snooped on, and you can't challenge it. And Val Morse here, and I think Mr. Locke, maybe Nicky Hager as well, may have been over the time the subject of investigations by the GCSB, but they will never know. Because the state can snoop on them, their email correspondence, their private correspondence, their cell phone records, and they won't know. So they can't challenge it. You're really left, in terms of this organisation, in terms of complaint, trying to protect your right using the law, essentially like a blind man looking for a black cat in a dark room that may or may not be there. And that's the nub of it. Also, as a lawyer, I've had numerous occasions when I have had clients who have been the subject of search warrants. I think of Operation 8, where the order were 18 as it was in the study whittled down. People there were the subject of surveillance for up to 15 years. One case I recall, they recorded when a man went into a pizza restaurant in Auckland in the 1990s. So there's been ongoing surveillance of a huge type. Recently, last year, I had a man who was investigated as part of an undercover operation, and he was accused of offering Class A for supply to an undercover officer. And what happened in that case was that a judge took the word of the officer, okayed a search warrant, and I tried to get copies of the recorded intercept conversations. "No, you can't have them, Mr. Bott." "Why is that?" "It will undermine the integrity of the investigation process." Well, I kept on and on and on, and finally, 3 days before trial, I heard these intercepted communications. This entire case on this young man was based upon the fact that an undercover officer engaged in a conversation with him when he was big noting whilst trolleyed on alcohol at a party. And the officer said, "Oh, can you supply us, with some Class A?" "No problem at all. I've sold a lot of the stuff. I've bought a house and a boat because of it." This is complete crap. This guy lived with his mum and dad, for Pete's sake. He had no brand new car or boat. He had a crapped out Holden ute. And that was it. Nothing. What's more, the officer took his word so seriously on that and cherry-picked 3 conversations. But I listened to all the conversations. And there was a phone call where he was discussing, similarly with the officer whilst tanked, that he could cut wood with his penis. The fact is, if you believe that conversation, why don't you believe that one? Why don't you give them equal weight? The fact is, when you take a conversation, or hundreds of conversations, and you cherry-pick bits, then put them before a minister to get a warrant, you can easily cherry-pick and take things completely out of context and put a sinister focus on something which in fact is quite innocent. And that happens all the time. But the fact is, it's those things where the lawyer looks at it that you know it's wrong and you can challenge it and get it laughed out of court. But when you've got a minister, like the Prime Minister, who's a once-over likely sort of fellow, those sorts of things don't get the attention they deserve. It's absolutely important. It might sound funny when I say it, but when people are arrested, their doors are kicked in, their kids are held at gunpoint, and their computers are seized. It's very serious indeed. Well, from George Orwell's 1984, New Zealand Bill of Rights Act, the Government Communications Security Bureaus Act 2003, Privacy Act, films like Minority Report, The Lives of Others, our literature and laws are full of warnings about state scrutiny. These warnings are commonplace, but often they're not very specific. What is this concept of privacy about? If you look on the blogosphere, particularly the right-wing blogosphere, we're often told, if you've done nothing wrong, you've got nothing to hide. It's sort of the logic, I suppose, of Commander Jessup from A Few Good Men. Do you remember that film? Jack Nicholson is Commander Jessup, and Tom Cruise is cross-examining him in the dock. And Jessup says, "Excuse my accent, you want answers?" "I think I'm entitled to them," Cruise says. "You want answers?" "You can't handle the truth. So we live in a world that has walls, and those walls have to be guarded by men with guns." Then he goes on like this, "Because there are bad guys out there, I'm entitled to cut corners and ride over civil liberties." And what happened there is that because there's no light, forensic light of open justice, civil liberties are dispensed with and injustice triumphs. I was thinking about that recently when I read the New Zealand Herald over the weekend, and there was a headline, "US spy device tested on New Zealand public." How many of you saw that? Yeah. Essentially, what's vitally important about that is that, in summary, New Zealand is trialling a tool called Thin Thread, which monitors the metadata of phone, internet and email communications. At first it masks the identity of the participants in the communications, and it only reveals those identities when the spies decide that they are concerned enough to apply for a warrant. So what you have even now, before the legislative change, is the fact that we are guinea pigs being subjected to fishing expeditions by our government, trialling out US technology. So it's one great state-sanctioned fishing expedition. That's even now. Now, why is surveillance harmful? Well, I can truthfully say that, as a lawyer, really, not all surveillance is harmful. Some of it's in fact quite beneficial. We need it. I'm not saying that, but really the unfettered and unchecked surveillance is deeply distressing and can be corrosive of civil liberties, freedom of expression, and good government in civil society. In one sense, surveillance is harmful because it can chill the exercise of our civil liberties. It gives the watcher the power over the watched. In terms of civil liberties, consider surveillance of people. People can see what other people are thinking, reading, communicating with others, formulating ideas, testing ideas. If you know that what you think and what you communicate can be snooped upon, you think twice about that. So in other words, part of civil society dies. I'm not talking about mad mullahs or whatever, suicide bombers, things like that, because that spills over into harm. But at the end of the day, when you're communicating and thinking about things and teasing things out, you do communicate and you have an exchange of ideas, and something magical about a society like that. If you can't do that, civil society in part dies. The other thing is that I suppose another harm is that constant surveillance or unchecked surveillance affects the power dynamic between the watcher and those that are watched. Think about the variety of harms such as discrimination, blackmail, selective enforcement, where the critics of government can be prosecuted or blackmailed for wrongdoing or to control them. The other thing is that really total surveillance, that's what we're talking about with something like thin thread, can have a tremendously chilling effect because it's got a huge power for abuse. Like its precursor, telephone wiretapping, it must be subjected to meaningful judicial control. There's a real risk when you have someone, a political figure, in charge of deciding whether agents can snoop and not snoop, to have corrosive elements and perhaps incorrect training, blinding decisions. I think of Muldoon in the days of the Moyle affair, claiming to have knowledge on Moyle and driving a decent man out of office because of the abuse, the extra power that he had. That's just corrosive and corrupt. I think of Herbert Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover, having phone wiretaps of Martin Luther King's agents and aides. 1972, I think it was, the House Select Committee in the States held a review of this material, and they agreed that they held this information to try and discredit Martin Luther King and his supporters. How will they do that? By way of blackmail, insinuation. These are our cards. If you don't do this, we're going to release them. A selective leak. Potential for the abuse, when that sort of control is put into political hands, particularly with someone who's as lackadaisical as our current Prime Minister, is extremely dangerous indeed. The other thing we cannot forget in terms of surveillance, and I raise this now, is that surveillance is not just about governments, but private companies, big and small. When you go and order a book online from Amazon or something like that, you create a data trail. When you use your credit card, you create a data trail. There are spending habits and patterns that can be seen. When you order a pizza over the phone, give your credit card, you also set up a data trail that can be tracked. Now, think of companies like Google and Facebook. You see, surveillance over time is becoming ingrained into the fabric of the web. There's a concept now called big data. And retail superstores in the States, like Target, for example, can tell if a woman's pregnant, they believe, because of her changes in spending patterns, the skin creams, the vitamins she uses. Then they suddenly target the advertisements to the young couple, the parents, the mum expecting, to put a pitch. All these things can be accessed by both the government and also the private sector. So whilst we're looking at the GCSB, don't forget at the same time that the private sector is also just as scary. The other thing we've got to be aware of as well is that technology also assists with surveillance. We all have a GPS system on our person, our cell phones. Whenever we walk about, we send a signal to a repeater station, and so it's possible to track where we are. These things are very, very dangerous. Now going back to, should we talk about perhaps surveillance and I suppose its chilling effect on society. If we turn to literature in the past, and I'm thinking here of Jeremy Bentham, the utilitarian, he came up with a concept of what's called the panopticon. Did anyone know what that was? Yeah. It's a prison where the warden is in the middle and all the cells are around, so this one person can surveil the entire prison and all the inmates. And this was designed around a central surveillance tower, and the warden can see into all the cells. And he describes the system thus: to be incessantly under the eyes of the inspector is to lose in effect the power to do evil, and almost the thought of wanting to do it. Now, in essence, with surveillance unchecked, what you have is an electronic form of a panopticon. No matter what you think, how you communicate online, tease out ideas and research, if you know that those ideas are being snooped on and watched by a big brother, it has a chilling effect upon free thought, education, communication. And you have a form of self-censorship. You think, if I go down there, someone may watch me. That's a chilling effect upon civil society. Surveillance also gives the watcher, shall we say, an increased power to persuade. This is a more subtle power. It's more subtle, but it can be used, I suppose I mentioned it before, to blackmail. It gives companies and governments the ability to persuade individuals. I talked about big data. In fact, they can pitch messages to people because they know their spending patterns and what they're doing. In the hands of the state, they can build up through algorithms a similar pattern. They can watch what you're doing, how you think, learn how to pitch a message, all these sorts of things. It's extremely worrying indeed. Now, why am I extremely concerned about this? Well, for all those reasons. But the other thing is this. Governments are meant to be the custodians and the guardians of our constitution. But I was thinking about that when I read an article about Simon Lusk, this strategist for the right, in the Dominion Post on the weekend. He had this quote: "National are only interested in preserving power for their existing MPs and do not care about the future beyond this administration." Now, if we apply that to any government, that's extremely worrying. We have to care about the rights of citizens beyond any administration, because we are guardians of a very precious thing, a living thing, our constitution. And yet, in a very short while, we've seen the erosion of the jury system. New Zealanders have had their right to elect trial by jury limited majorly. We've had the ability or the right to choose counsel of choice dispensed with. And now we're seeing more than ever the limitation by this government of the right of citizens to seek recourse to the courts when they believe that their rights are being infringed. So I see this as part of an ongoing culture in New Zealand, where our constitution is being slowly whittled away and our protections are being dispensed with. We've seen the growth of search and surveillance with the search and surveillance bill being steamrolled through the House. We're seeing patronage with sports people being elected, or rather appointed, to important human rights bodies. And now we have this sort of legislation being pushed through the House now at a time when it requires proper, considered forensic analysis. I want to turn very quickly